sessions in the throughout the whole country. Dan Taylor's on the phone and down free or unfortunately make mistakes of understanding is reactive use and the and Friday the state 30 years old and pure because more with employees for the most in the last several years has been the Affordable Care Act, and that's created a whole learning curve in terms of compliance and how to do things the right way. And so, it's nice to take the time today to circle back to COBRA. It's been around a while. A lot of employers have dealt with it for many years, but there's some important reminders here in terms of understanding what this is. One thing we try to establish is that this is an employer law, not an insurance law. And that sounds a little funny, but basically, the law, it was created to give individuals, former employees, spouses, or dependent children, the right to stay on the employer's health plan after they had lost the coverage due to a specific event. And they have these rights under this law, COBRA, that they have to be notified of by the employer. And that's why we really view this as an employer law. Employers have the responsibility to inform people of their rights and explain how this whole thing works. And if the employer fails to inform their beneficiaries, their employees and families of these rights, then it creates a lot of liability because somebody may not end up getting the coverage that they need, and that creates liability on the employer. Or the federal government comes in and is auditing an employer for certain laws, COBRA being one of them, that if they find that they haven't been doing COBRA properly, will assess penalties or fines or excise taxes. So it's important that employers handle this correctly and make sure that they know what they're required to do, and then have a plan or process for delivering that result, the compliance with the law. This law has changed many times over the years, and even when the Affordable Care Act came along, even though it didn't specifically change any parts of COBRA, it changed the entire environment, really, in terms of which COBRA it operates. So I may make some references to the Affordable Care Act today. Because of the Affordable Care Act, though, there is greater scrutiny on health plans, and any attention that's drawn, where the IRS or the DOL or anybody else enforcing these laws is reviewing what an employer is doing, opens up the possibility that there could be an error, there could be a consequence to not doing COBRA properly. So we're going to go through this today with that liability and that responsibility in mind. Ultimately, we're trying to protect you, the employer, from making mistakes that create liability for your company. In terms of possible consequences, getting a little bit more specific, there are really two kinds of consequences for failing to properly comply with COBRA. The first one is simply that the federal government that is responsible for enforcing this law, and there are two bodies of the government that do this, and that's the IRS and Department of Labor. They both have rules and regulations. They both have authority for enforcement. And if either of them end up auditing an employer, either because of a random type of a situation where they're going to audit so many employers a year, or maybe there's a specific request or a situation that requires them to take a closer look, if they come in and perform that audit, there could be penalties if there are problems. Typically, the DOL, when they do an audit, if they find certain types of violations, they'll refer over to the IRS, because the IRS has the ability to assess excise taxes, and that's generally how you see this law enforced. The excise tax that the IRS can apply to an employer works like this. If an employer makes a mistake, there's a violation of the COBRA law, the IRS can penalize or tax that employer, if it's a single person, $100 per day from the date of the violation. If it's more than a single person, it could be $200 per day per violation. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. So let's say the IRS is conducting an audit on an employer, and they're looking through records of COBRA notices that have been sent compared to terminations of employment or other situations where people lose coverage. If they find that somebody was not sent a timely notice, then they may assess this excise tax. So in general, an employer has as many as 44 days to mail out a COBRA notice following a qualifying event. So this is the offer of COBRA, in which we've had an event, we've had a loss of coverage, the beneficiaries must be notified that they have the right to stay on the health plan. And if the employer, let's say, for whatever reason, mails out that notice 30 days late, and the IRS discovers this in the course of an audit, they can penalize for every day that notice was late. So if it's a single person, it's $100 a day times 30 days. That's $3,000. If it's a family or more than single, it could be as much as $200 per day. Again, for 30 days in this example, that would be $6,000. And the scary thing is that, sometimes employers fail to send out a notice at all in certain situations. And technically that dollar amount is adding up daily, potentially, if there's an audit. So we can see where that consequence can grow fairly quickly. The other type of consequence that comes up with this law is that if the employer fails to properly notify somebody of their rights, and then as a result, that person does not have coverage. So either the employer never sent a notice, or maybe the notice they sent was incomplete or inaccurate or out of date. In other words, what information came along to that beneficiary was not complete and accurate. And because of that lack or incorrect information, that person did not elect COBRA. And then 6 months later, that person has a car accident or a cancer diagnosis or something where there's going to be big medical bills and they don't have coverage. They potentially have a claim against that employer for failing to properly notify them of how COBRA is supposed to work and what their rights are. In that case, the employer could be responsible for covering those claims. Carriers are not going to be on the hook necessarily for covering those things. If that was an employer mistake, they're going to say, okay, employer, that's your responsibility. And unfortunately, when we look at situations like that, we're talking about claims that can get very high, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so that's a big liability. So I guess my point here is that if we do everything we're supposed to do when it comes to the COBRA law, then we can minimize or hopefully eliminate the chance that there's going to be one of these two types of consequences, either an audit scenario or a lawsuit. So that's what we're trying to accomplish today. Let me jump into who must comply. This is an important section just because sometimes employers fall in and out of whether they have to comply or not with this law. And it gets a little confusing about counting employees. So let me cover this. The magic number for COBRA is 20 employees. If an employer had 20 or more employees for at least half their business days during the preceding calendar year, then they would have to comply for the current calendar year. So 20 or more last year means comply this year. So here we are in September, I guess, already. And it doesn't really matter how many employees the employer has today. It's how many did they have in 2016. Okay. Now, there are certain groups that are exempt from COBRA. One is a church plan. If the church plan meets the definition of a church plan that's found in section, I believe it's 414E of the Internal Revenue Code, then they would be exempt from having to comply with COBRA. The federal government, of course, they write the rules, and apparently they don't have to follow the rules. They have some similar rules that they have to follow, apparently, but it's not COBRA. They are exempt. And then if an employer is under 20 during that previous calendar year, then they would be exempt as well. There are a lot of states that have state continuation laws for groups that are under 20. And so that's something else to keep in mind. And we're not going to get into state continuation today. This is strictly the federal COBRA law. So we're going to focus on those groups that have 20 or more employees. Now let's just take that a little bit deeper in terms of how we count employees. We're going to count, again, looking back at last year, all full-time employees plus part-time employees, and we need to do the conversion of those part-time hours to full-time equivalents, okay? But we need to count everybody, even if they were not eligible for benefits, all right? We count them all, add together the full-time plus the full-time equivalents, and then the rules say you can evaluate this over either every day or every pay period. I don't know if many of you are familiar with how we count employees for determining if you're an applicable large employer under the Affordable Care Act, but that works differently. That's more based on an average each month, and that number is 50, not 20. But when it comes to COBRA, you'd have to, let's take the easier route. Let's just break the year down by pay period. If you paid twice a month, that's 24 pay periods. What you need to do is say, okay, pay period number 1, we were at 19. Pay period number 2, we were at 20. Pay period number 3, we were at 19. And then you do that for all 24 pay periods. If you are under 20 for a majority of those pay periods, then you're not going to have to comply with COBRA the next year. If you were at 20 or more for a majority of those pay periods, then you would. That's how that works. Okay, so it's important to understand that if you're close to 20, be very careful in terms of how you count your employees and make sure it's done the right way, so that you don't either offer COBRA when you didn't need to, or you're not offering COBRA when you're supposed to. Another couple of factors here that we need to consider is that common ownership might be a factor. The IRS has defined something called a controlled group, and so that means that if there's enough common ownership between multiple groups, then we have to consider them really as one employer for counting employees to determine whether they had 20 or more, so keep that in mind. Foreign employees do count. Multi-employer plans would be like a union plan, and even though maybe they're not eligible for your plan, but they're covered through the union plan, they're still your employees and they still count in towards that total. Okay, so hopefully that answers any questions for those of you that might be near that 20 count. Okay, and remember, if you have any questions as I'm going through this, please submit that using the chat function in the meeting software, and I'd be glad to tackle those questions as we go. Okay, all right. The next slide we're going to come to is it's called TAMRA, and this is an acronym for something called the Technical and Miscellaneous Revenue Act. And this is from 1988. So this is a while ago, but it's important because this really laid out the criteria by which the IRS can audit an employer. And so if we know that in an audit they're going to look for certain things, it's important to maybe have those things in place and ready to go. Now, I gave you some examples earlier of how audits might work. Sometimes somebody complains and that could trigger an audit. Sometimes they're coming in to audit for ERISA or benefit plans in general, and just because COBRA really is part of that, they're going to, I'm sure, touch on that during that audit. Sometimes they just decide, okay, we're going to randomly select 50,000 employers this year and audit them for COBRA or for ERISA. So sometimes it's just sort of an audit through the mail where they send a letter and say, okay, please send us these things, and we'll let you know how it comes out. If the IRS does come in to perform an audit, and if they do find a mistake, they will actually categorize the mistake. Okay? They'll consider it either reasonable cause or willful neglect. And what happens here is if the mistake is under reasonable cause, then they could reduce or waive the penalty. But if they consider it to be willful neglect, then they cannot. So how do we make sure that if we did make an error, it is hopefully minor enough that we can be on the reasonable cause side of this audit process? Well, there's really two ways that happens. One, does the employer have certain TAMRA guidelines in place? And I'll tell you what those are in the next slide. And did they correct the mistake within 30 days? If they have those two things handled, then they could reduce or waive the penalty. If they're missing those two things, then they cannot. One interesting way of seeing the reality of this, you'll see down at the bottom of the page, and I realize there's no manual with this, but it's still referencing, there's a IRS tax form called Form 8928. If you were to Google that and pull that up, that would be the form that gets completed if you have to pay penalties because of a COBRA error. And it shows you how those penalties are calculated, and it does have a section on whether it's reasonable cause, and then a separate section if it's willful neglect. So you can kind of see the exact application of these definitions right there within that tax form. The basic guidelines under this law that the IRS is going to expect to see are these things right here. One, does that employer have some evidence, some documentation that they've had COBRA training? Okay, that's going to be important. They know that this is a complicated law. They know that this is something that is better handled with some sort of formal training, and so they might want to see documentation of what training you have had. The second thing they're going to want to see is, do you have written instructions on how you comply with COBRA? Now, this is important because, one, if you have written instructions for how you comply with COBRA, meaning, when we enroll people on the health plan, here's our process for sending out the general notice. When people have a qualifying event and lose coverage, here's our process for sending out qualifying event election notices. Or when there's an extension of COBRA, here's what we do. When, you've got a list, a process that you follow. When you have that, you are more likely to do it the same way every time, and you're consistent, and that makes it tougher for you to get in trouble. You always want to do things the same way every time and not deviate from that. The second thing it does is it creates continuity within your organization. I'm guessing that those of you that are on the call today were not the original person at your company responsible for COBRA. You got this job at some point or got promoted into this job and you realized COBRA was a part of it. The question is did you have an existing set of written instructions to use and just continue doing that going forward? So, the employer maintained compliance regardless of whether that responsibility for handling the COBRA process changed from one person to another. If you, unfortunately, most people got the new job and stepped into it and there was no process, maybe there were just a couple of Word documents that you used to send out notices with. Maybe you used an outside administrator and hopefully there was some direction on how to use that service. But if you don't have written instructions, the IRS is going to view the employer as not trying hard enough to be compliant. This is set out as a need, an expectation, and if the employer doesn't have it, it increases the risk of paying a penalty. The third item here is your program, and by program I mean basically your notices and your procedures. Were they designed and updated by what they refer to as competent professional advice? Now, generally, I would say an ERISA attorney is the most competent professional advice you can get. We use ERISA attorneys to make sure that our processes and procedures and notices are all sound. The IRS would expect that something similar on your end, that you didn't just pull this together on your own, that you've had some legal oversight into what you're doing. Again, this is a federal law. These documents I would consider to be legal documents. It makes sense that you've had legal consultation on the accuracy and correctness of those documents. Finally, is your program monitored? Does somebody from time to time review potential COBRA activity and then look for documentation that notices were sent out as required? And so is there some oversight? It could be somebody completely independent of your company, like a CPA or somebody that provides an audit type of a service. Maybe it's somebody from within the company, but it shouldn't be anybody directly related to getting those COBRA notices out the door. It should be somebody outside of that scope. So if these four things are in place, then the chances for having a penalty or an excise tax assessed gets much lower. And so that's important to have in place. Once you've got these four things in place, then we can start thinking about, okay, here's a list of all the things that we need to be prepared to handle. And this is, I guess, kind of here's what the rest of this webinar is going to look like. Do you have proper notification procedures? We just talked about them needing to be written, but they still need to be appropriate and accurate based on what the rules and regulations require. Are the notices that you send out accurate and up to date? That's that notification language that's really critical, because those notices carry the message of COBRA to those people that have the right to stay on the health plan. We need to make sure that those are properly put together so that there's no question as to whether or not that person was properly informed of their rights. There are COBRA timeframes involved. There are deadlines to do things. And as I mentioned earlier, when you miss a deadline, that's going to create potential liability, especially in an audit situation. Consistency, I touched on that already. That's going to be important. Calculating premium rates. I mean, there are limits as to how much you can charge for COBRA. The general rule is 102% of what it costs you to provide the coverage. There are times when it's different than that. We'll talk about that near the end, but the key point here is don't overcharge for COBRA. That's going to create liability. The final item here is COBRA's terminating events. When does COBRA end? When we get near the end of this today, I've got a few slides that specifically cover what types of events will terminate somebody's COBRA. But the point I guess I want to make here at the beginning is that that's really important, because a common error that employers make is that they're not tracking somebody's COBRA time frame very well, or they're failing to terminate COBRA when it should be terminated. And what happens then is you've got people that stay on the plan longer than they should be there. And that creates some potential problems. One, if you gave one person more time on COBRA, you're setting a precedent, and other people are going to want to stay on COBRA longer potentially. You don't want that. Secondly, who takes COBRA? Well, COBRA is expensive. I mean, it's just your regular health plan premium plus 2%, but a lot of times employees don't really understand the true cost of coverage until they get that COBRA notice, and they think, oh my gosh, COBRA is so expensive. Well, it's not COBRA that's expensive, it's your health plan in general that's expensive. You've just never had to pay for the whole thing before. And people rarely take COBRA because of that. Those that do take COBRA and are willing to pay that premium are probably sick, and they don't want to mess up their deductible. They don't want to change doctors. They don't want to rock the boat in any way because they're in the middle of some sort of a treatment plan. And so those folks are affecting your rates potentially. If you were supposed to have terminated their COBRA and you failed to do that, that's extra experience that's going into potentially your rate calculation for the next year. And finally, you know, if you let somebody stay on COBRA too long and there is again, a big claim, let's say, a car accident. So let me give you this example. One COBRA event is a divorce. A divorce would require the employer to offer COBRA to that ex-spouse for 36 months. That's 3 years. And so let's say that ex-spouse takes COBRA and is paying in their premium every month. And this has been going on for 3 years. And the employer has lost track of when COBRA is supposed to end, and the check just keeps coming. And the check arrives every month. The employer cashes the check, comes the next month, cash the check. All of a sudden, instead of terminating COBRA at the end of 36 months, we're in month 42. We just never terminated their coverage. We weren't paying attention. Well, then that person has a car accident. They've got $250,000 in medical bills. When you turn in that kind of a claim to a carrier, they're not going to pay that much without reviewing the claim. And if they go back and review all of the details leading up to that situation, they might just discover that, wait a minute, this person was on the plan only because they were on COBRA, and that COBRA should have ended at the end of 36 months. We're 6 months past that. We don't have to pay that. And now you've got a really sticky situation because the person who paid a premium and thought they were covered is now being told they don't have coverage. And are they going to try to hold the employer responsible for that? Probably. I'm not saying that's an automatic win by them by any means, but there's going to be some legal fees involved at a minimum at that point, right, trying to make that problem go away. So it's important that we do the things at the beginning that we need to do. And I think most employers are fairly familiar with those, but also at the end, we've got to make sure that we end that coverage when it's supposed to end as well. Okay, the next section we're going to cover is qualified beneficiaries. And in this section, we talk about who gets COBRA and what rights they have. It's important to understand this because sometimes people on COBRA actually can do things that we wouldn't normally think they could do. Okay, for example, let's say that we're talking about my family. I will be the covered employee. My wife will be the covered spouse. I've got 2 children. You can see them represented here on the screen. If I worked at company A and we were all covered on the health plan, when I quit, we're all going to lose coverage, and they're going to offer us COBRA for 18 months. Termination of employment is an 18-month event. Let's say I'm in the process of getting a new job, and let's say that I'm covered, but we have to pay extra or something different for the family, and let's say that we choose that only I will go on the new plan. So when we get that COBRA notice offering us COBRA from my previous employer, I know I'm already covered. I really don't need it, but my wife and children do. So first of all, let's define a qualified beneficiary. A qualified beneficiary is anybody that was on the plan the day of the qualifying event and lost coverage as a result of that event. So how many qualified beneficiaries are in my family? There's 4. Me, my wife, my 2 children. We're all offered COBRA. Okay. The first type of right that qualified beneficiaries have is they have independent election rights. So when we get that COBRA notice and we're being offered COBRA, I don't want it or need it because I'm already covered on my new employer's plan. But because of either the cost or the coverage level or for some reason, our option is better for the family to stay on my previous employer's plan under COBRA. So we don't elect for me, but we elect for my wife and children. Can we do that? Absolutely. Qualified beneficiaries have independent election rights. They no longer have to rely on me to establish coverage first, like when I'm an active employee and I want to add my family. When it comes to COBRA, it's like we all have separate decisions to make. Does Dan want it? Does Dan's wife want it? Does Dan's children want it? And then we can elect accordingly. Okay, so independent election rights is a big part of what we explain in COBRA notices to qualified beneficiaries. The second type of right that we have for qualified beneficiaries is that they have the same rights as an active employee. they can do whatever an active employee can do. All right. So let me give you this example. Let's say that my wife and I get divorced. So my wife loses coverage. My employer offers my wife COBRA for 36 months. During that 36 months, my wife gets remarried. Can my wife add her new spouse to the plan? Well, because my wife is a qualified beneficiary, the question the employer has to ask him or herself is, well, if she were an active employee and got married, would she be allowed to add her new spouse to the plan? And assuming that answer is yes, then yes, she as a qualified beneficiary can add her new spouse to the plan. Okay, she has the same rights as an active employee. Even though she was never an employee, she was the spouse. Once you have a qualified beneficiary and it comes to COBRA, each qualified beneficiary gets treated and is allowed to do with the plan whatever an active employee is allowed to do in terms of choosing coverage, in terms of choosing other family members that are covered. You know, when in doubt, you're going to ask, okay, what would an active employee be able to do? And that's what you're going to let that qualified beneficiary do. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So two types of rights: independent election rights and same rights as active employees. All right, so that's the key message from this slide here. Okay, the last little box on this page was an amendment to COBRA that came along back in, I think, 1996, got over 20 years ago already. And what it did is it created a new classification of qualified beneficiary, and it basically says this: if there's a child that is born to or adopted by the person who was the covered employee while that covered employee or former employee was on COBRA, that child is considered to be a qualified beneficiary. In my original definition of a qualified beneficiary, as I said, it was anybody who was covered at the time of the qualifying event and then lost coverage as a result of that event. This is a child that comes along later. And it's simply saying by virtue of that birth or adoption, as long as it was to the person who was the covered employee, that child is going to have independent election rights and the same rights as active employees if needed. So we just make sure that we include that. What if, let me go back to my earlier example in the divorce scenario. So Dan and Sheila got divorced, or I'm sorry, my wife's name is Sheila. Dan and his wife got divorced, and so she is offered COBRA for 36 months and then gets remarried. Well, is that person who she married and is being added to the coverage considered a qualified beneficiary? And the answer is no. That person was not on the plan at the time of the original event. That was Dan and spouse's divorce. This person came along later and is only covered because that ex-spouse had the right to add that person, but that doesn't give that person any rights. Okay, that's why this particular amendment regarding newborns or adopted children is important, because under the way the law was originally written, they wouldn't be qualified beneficiaries either. But there were circumstances in which they knew that there could be a reason that that child, might need to have coverage on its own, and so we need to make sure that that child has those rights. That's just a tenuous situation when you've got a newborn and they need to make sure that they're covered. So that's the story on that last box at the bottom of the page. Okay. All right. Going on to the next slide. And again, if you have any questions, please submit those questions via the chat function, and I'd be glad to answer those as we go. The next section here is qualifying events. When do we offer COBRA? What events are going to trigger that responsibility for the employer? So first of all, let me clarify what qualifies. There are two components to this. There has to be an event, and I'll tell you what those are in the next couple of slides, and it must cause a loss of coverage. Sometimes you could have an event and it not cause a loss of coverage, or more likely, you could have a loss of coverage that was not caused by one of these events. So if you don't have both one of these events and it caused a loss of coverage, it is not a COBRA qualifying event. The common scenario is that if you had an employee and spouse who were covered on the plan, open enrollment comes along for the next plan year, and the employee just chooses to drop the spouse. And let's say, even though maybe they're not required to tell you why, but let's say they tell you that, well, my spouse has a new job and, he or she is going to be covered on that plan. And so I'm not going to re-enroll him or her for this coming plan year. That person is losing coverage, but was it caused by an event? No, it was just the voluntary choice that that employee made. That's not COBRA. So I want to kind of dispel the notion that if anybody's coming off the plan, I have to offer them COBRA. That's not true. Only when that loss of coverage is caused by one of these events. There are two types of events. There are 18-month events and 36-month events. The 18-month events are when somebody quits or their employment is terminated, so voluntary or involuntary termination, or their hours become low enough that they are no longer considered eligible for benefits. If any of those cause a loss of coverage, then that employee and or family members would be offered COBRA for 36 months. Okay. One thing to pay attention to here is that if you do have to comply with the Affordable Care Act because you're over 50, you're an applicable large employer, what a lot of employers do is they use something called the look-back measurement method to track hours and to once a year determine whether or not somebody is full-time or not, and therefore eligible for benefits or not. So it's possible that as you go through that process, somebody who was full-time last year may not have worked enough hours to be considered full-time for this next year and is therefore not offered benefits. That would be a COBRA qualifying event because their reduction in work hours caused a loss of coverage. So just be aware that those types of situations could trigger COBRA. There is an exception, and you see it here under involuntary termination, that if somebody is terminated, again, involuntarily, due to gross misconduct, that is not a COBRA qualifying event. Involuntary termination due to gross misconduct is not COBRA. The problem with this is the second bullet point here. What is gross misconduct? It is not defined by the federal government. There's all kinds of case law that probably set some examples here of what is or what isn't, but an employer isn't necessarily going to know what should be or should not be gross misconduct. And we kind of have a philosophy around here when it comes to gross misconduct: when in doubt, send it out. If you're not sure if it's gross misconduct or not, it may just be safer to consider that it's not gross misconduct and go ahead and send out the COBRA notice and offer COBRA accordingly. That's really up to each employer on how you handle that, or whether you want to try to define it. Or I've heard of some employers might get with their legal counsel and define it and put it in the employee handbook so that everybody's clear that, okay, if you do something just, within this definition, you're not going to be offered COBRA. That's still awfully hard to do. I've been here a long time and I've had many people call in with questions. One time I had a caller tell me and say, hey, we terminated somebody because they punched their boss in the face and knocked him out right there at work. And, isn't that gross misconduct? We don't have to offer them COBRA, do we? And, my answer was, well, unfortunately, I don't have any working definition under the federal law as to what is or isn't gross misconduct. So it's really up for you to determine, and you got to weigh the pluses and minuses. What's the downside of offering it? Well, they'll take it and they'll have to pay for it. Okay, that's not too terrible, I guess. Or what's the downside if you don't offer it? Well, they might disagree with your considering that to be gross misconduct, and they might sue you. And you can see here that there have been many lawsuits on this matter, and sometimes the employer wins, sometimes the employee wins. If you have to go to federal court to figure it out, I mean, it's 50-50. You just don't know. That's why you're going to court. So, our philosophy is that we need to avoid court at almost any cost. Certainly need to avoid the audit scenario. Let's do things the right way. Let's be smart about it and go on. Just for a little interest story here. One time I had a caller tell me and say, hey, we just fired somebody because they burned the place down. They're now in prison for arson. That's got to be gross misconduct, right? We really don't want to offer that person COBRA. I said, well, boy, if anything is going to qualify, I would think that would be it. But again, I kind of had to have the reality conversation to say, you know, even though it appears pretty obvious, it isn't defined. What's the worst thing that can happen if you offer it? Well, they could take it, but what are the chances they're going to take it? I mean, there's only a 5 to 10% chance anyways. And plus the fact that this person's in prison, they're already covered. They're on what they call the state plan at this point. So there just isn't much of a downside to offering it anyways. So, I mean, that's a conversation to have with your legal counsel in any of those situations. But again, what do we need to do to minimize our risk here? The other law that kind of impacts these events in terms of 18-month events is the Family and Medical Leave Act. Some of you may have to comply with FMLA. The important point here is that if somebody stops working because they're on FMLA, that by itself is not a COBRA qualifying event. If at the end of FMLA they do not return to work or they're not working enough hours to be covered, now you can offer COBRA because their coverage is their opportunity for coverage is no longer protected by FMLA. And if they're not working full time or meeting the requirements or simply terminating employment, now you've got a termination of employment that's causing a loss of coverage, or you have a reduction in work hours that's causing a loss of coverage. In either case, you're going to offer COBRA for 18 months. Okay, so FMLA comes first, and then at the end of FMLA, if they're not back to work full time, you would offer COBRA due to either termination or reduction of hours. Okay, so that I think covers the 18-month events. The next events are the 36-month events. So if the employee passes away and therefore a spouse or dependent children lose coverage, they would be offered COBRA for 36 months. I'm going to skip Medicare entitlement for just a second. I'll come back to it. In a divorce or legal separation, if that causes a loss of coverage, and again, whether it's the spouse or spouse and children, whoever happens to lose coverage as a result of that divorce, they would be offered COBRA for 36 months. When a dependent child ceases to be an eligible dependent, and now with the ACA, they've defined that as when they turn age 26, then that would be a COBRA qualifying event, and that dependent would be offered COBRA for 36 months. Okay? The employee never gets COBRA for 36 months. It's only spouses and dependent children. Medicare entitlement. If an employee were to become entitled to Medicare, and if that were to cause a loss of coverage for a spouse or dependent child, that spouse or dependent child would be offered COBRA for 36 months. The thing about Medicare entitlement is that it doesn't cause that loss of coverage very often. Many of you have had an employee who's actively working, they're on your health plan, and they turn age 65. That's the most common reason people go on Medicare. Well, unless your group is really small, under 20, and therefore wouldn't have to comply with COBRA anyways, if you're 20 or more, you're not allowed to force somebody off your health plan just because they go on Medicare. All right? What tends to happen is that the employee, now that they have Medicare, might choose on their own to drop their group health coverage. And that might cause a spouse or dependent child to lose coverage. But in that case, what caused the loss of coverage? It was a voluntary choice the employee made. The employee was still fully eligible to stay on the plan along with their family. But once the employee chooses to end their coverage and the spouse and dependent children lose coverage, they lose coverage, but it's not COBRA because one of these events did not cause that loss of coverage. I hope everybody sees that as a voluntary choice made by that employee, not a forced loss of coverage because of some event. Okay, I hope that makes sense. In a minute, we're going to talk about extensions to COBRA, and we're going to revisit that very same topic. Just as Medicare entitlement is rarely an original qualifying event, it's going to rarely be an extension to COBRA as well. You're probably wondering, well, when is it going to be a qualifying event? Well, I can think of two examples here. One could be that employee is going on Medicare due to disability. And the Medicare secondary payer rules do say that if that the employer has fewer than 100 employees, you actually can terminate the family's coverage because that employee went on Medicare. So that could happen if the group was under 100 and the Medicare was due to disability. The second example would be if the employer offers a retiree plan, which would still be subject to COBRA. And if on the retiree plan, the person that is the retiree or the former employee, if they were to go on Medicare and it might cause a family member to lose coverage, then you'd have to offer COBRA for 36 months to that family member. Otherwise, we're just not going to see that happen very much at all. The key for some of these events is, how does the employer know that they've occurred? How do you know when that divorce occurred? That's the most common one that's a bit of an issue. Well, some of these you can put the responsibility on the family. The first slide here of events, these are all the responsibility of the employer to deal with. When somebody's employment ends, reduction of hours, et cetera, et cetera. There's no burden on the family to report it to the employer in order for that family member to get COBRA. But which ones are missing? Divorce and dependent child ceasing to be an eligible dependent. These can be put on the employee and family as a responsibility to notify the employer when these things happen. So when does that generally happen? How does that family know that they have this responsibility? And that's covered typically in the very first COBRA notice that somebody receives when they first go on the plan. It's called the general COBRA notice. And in that notice, it's telling them in general how COBRA is going to work in the future. But oh, by the way, you have responsibilities now that you're on our health plan, that if there's a divorce or if there's a dependent child ceasing to be an eligible dependent, that you do have to notify us if you want us to offer COBRA to that spouse or other family member. Okay. We added disability and a secondary event here. I'm going to cover that in the next section. But that is also the responsibility of the family to report to the employer. All right. So these things, that burden is put on the family. One other scenario that I'll cover that gets a little bit confusing. Divorce, comes up unfortunately a lot, and it gets a little confusing as to how that gets handled. One particular aspect can happen, and you need to know that there's a special rule on how to handle it. So here's the scenario. Let's say that my wife and I are covered on your health plan, and open enrollment comes along, and I'm the employee, and I choose not to re-enroll my wife for the next plan year. And, I have the right to do that. You can't question me really on, hey, why are you doing that? But let's say I do that. And then 6 months later, my wife calls you, the employer, up and says, hi, this is Dan's wife. Well, actually ex-wife, because we got divorced. It was final a week ago. And I remember reading somewhere that I had to report to you that we had a divorce. And so that's what I'm doing, because I know that there's something about me being able to get health insurance because of the divorce. COBRA, is that what it's called? And so now you, the employer, are being told by this ex-spouse that a divorce did happen, and it was within the time frame. They have 60 days to report it, and this was only within the last week, so it's well within that time frame. Yet this person hasn't been on the plan for 6 months. Do they still get COBRA? And the answer is yes. And I'll show you this slide here that explains why. They still get COBRA because of a rule that the IRS wrote that basically says this: if somebody is removed from the plan in anticipation of a COBRA qualifying event, such as a divorce in this example, then the employer is to treat that person as if they were still covered at that time and offer COBRA if required. And so it's not too tough to probably connect the dots that the reason I didn't re-enroll my wife is because the divorce was in process, and I figured why keep her covered or why pay that extra premium? I'm just going to drop her and move on. Well, she was dropped in anticipation of the divorce, and therefore she would still need to be offered COBRA for 36 months from the date of that divorce. There's actually no requirement to go back and cover the 6 months that she was not on the plan, which is kind of weird. It would still be measured from the divorce date. So again, that's kind of I won't call it a really strange scenario because it does happen quite often, but that's one to keep your eye on that, okay, if somebody gets dropped and then at some point down the road, they come back and explain why they got dropped was due to a divorce or some other qualifying event that was anticipated, then you're going to have to treat that person as if they were still on the plan and just now losing coverage because of that event. That's kind of a crazy one, but an important one to keep in mind. All right. Okay, let's keep rolling along here. COBRA extensions. As I kind of alluded to a couple of slides ago, there are two different ways that COBRA can be extended beyond the original 18 months. So if somebody is on COBRA because of a termination or reduction of work hours, that means they're on COBRA for 18 months. If a second event occurs, they can extend COBRA. Or if a disability occurs and all the criteria are met, they can extend COBRA. So let me kind of show you each one of those. So this first slide represents the secondary event scenario. So on the left-hand side of the slide, let's say I'm the employee, the family is covered on the plan, I quit, my whole family loses coverage. Let's say you're the employer, you offer us COBRA for 18 months, let's say we take it. We're on COBRA. At some point during that 12 months, let's say I died. Well, death of the employee is a COBRA qualifying event. So in this case, the family gets to use it as a second event or an extension to COBRA, and that will now allow them to have a total of 36 months of COBRA instead of 18. Now that 36 months is measured from the original qualifying event date, so my original termination date, not measured from the death or not stacked on top of the 18. It's a total of 36. That second event could be any of those 4 36-month events. Death of the employee, divorce, dependent child ceasing to be an eligible dependent, Medicare entitlement, we talked about that a few minutes ago, that could trigger a secondary event, but the way the IRS has written rules and regulations around it is they say, but only if had it been the original event, it would have been a COBRA qualifying event. So as I say that, thinking back to what I covered a few minutes ago, Medicare entitlement just doesn't very often cause a loss of coverage in which COBRA then has to be offered. Therefore, it's going to, just as rarely be a secondary event. So most of your secondary events are going to be either deaths of the employee, divorces, or dependent children ceasing to be eligible dependents. The second type of extension is due to disability. And this works like this. There's really 4 different criteria to qualify for this extension. If the 4 criteria are met, then actually the whole family can extend from 18 months to a total of 29. So it's not 36 like a secondary event, it's only 29 because of disability. And the reason why is the writers of this part of the law wanted to get that person to Medicare, and that's roughly how long it takes somebody who's disabled to get on Medicare. It's about 29 months. And so this is simply meant to extend COBRA until they can get on Medicare. But the criteria are these. The first one is that the family member, it can be anybody in the family, it does not have to be the employee, but if any family member is deemed disabled according to the Social Security Administration, then that's the first step. If nobody has been deemed disabled by Social Security, then this is not going to be an extension to COBRA. The second requirement is that the disability, according to Social Security, must have begun no later than the 60th day on COBRA. Okay, so a person can't have been on COBRA for a year and then had a car accident and be deemed disabled and then still extended out to 29 months. That disability must have occurred no later than the 60th day on COBRA. The third criteria is that the employee or family member must notify the employer within 60 days of, and there's a couple of different dates here, the date that they're notified by Social Security that they're disabled, the loss of coverage date, the qualifying event date, or the date first notified that they had this reporting responsibility, 60 days from the later of those 4 dates. Okay. If you need a little more detail on that, or you couldn't write fast enough to cover that, you let us know, and I can send you something that breaks that down a little bit more clearly for you. Hopefully, if you look at whatever COBRA notice you're currently using, that should all be spelled out. So I guess I'd go there first, and if you're not sure if it's correct or not, then you can let us know. If the fourth criteria is that the family member must notify the employer within the original 18 months based on the first qualifying event. So those are the 4 ways or requirements to get the extension. Once those 4 things are met, then the entire family can go that extra 11 months from 18 out to 29. But one thing that changes is what the employer can charge for the COBRA premium. The maximum is 102% for that first 18 months. But starting with the extension, which would begin in month 19, that maximum premium goes up to 150%. Okay, so I'm not saying an employer has to charge that, but that's the new maximum. So as an employer, you need to consider, will we charge 150% for that extension or not? That's up to you. All right. So hopefully those made sense in terms of secondary events or disability in ways that a family or a family member can extend COBRA from 18 months to something longer. All right. So the next section is all about which coverages fall under COBRA, which plans have to be offered when somebody has a qualifying event. And the definition, and I'm going to read this off, so hopefully it'll make sense, although you're probably not going to be able to write it down this quickly. But there are 2 definitions that the IRS uses to define a health plan. First of all, they define a health plan as a plan maintained by an employer or employee organization for the purpose of providing health care, whether directly, through insurance, reimbursement, or otherwise. Okay, so that's how they define a group health plan. It provides health care. Well, what is health care? That's the second definition. Health care is defined as the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease and any other undertaking for the purpose of affecting a function or structure of the body. So when you think about that and we start looking at all the different types of benefits that you offer, I can clearly tell you that your medical plan meets that definition, your dental plan, your vision plan, the prescription coverage meets that definition. After those 4, it gets a little bit fuzzier, I would say. Some of you may offer an employee assistance program. That might be construed as health care. You're going to have to kind of evaluate, what that plan entails and whether it provides those items that I just listed. A wellness program or even voluntary plans are still plans that provide health care. And so you need to evaluate those types of plans and determine if somebody loses them and therefore is incurring a loss of coverage, do they have to be offered COBRA? The one here that isn't on the left-hand list, but probably should be since I have a couple of slides coming up next on it, are flexible spending accounts. Do flexible spending accounts have to be offered under COBRA? Well, the answer is maybe. First of all, the dependent care FSA does not. That is not health care. That's something different. But the health FSA, that is health care. That is a reimbursement plan, which is what was in that definition I read off a minute ago. But sometimes the FSA is offered and sometimes it's not. I'm going to cover that in the next couple of slides, but FSAs would go on the left-hand slide, as would health reimbursement arrangements, HRAs. COBRA does not apply to life insurance. That's not healthcare. Disability coverage is not healthcare. HSAs are an account set aside for healthcare, but the employee already owns it. That cannot be taken away from them, and so they've indicated that the health savings account itself does not have to be offered. They already own it. Now, the high deductible health plan is the medical plan. That would have to be offered. So let's kind of delve into FSAs here for a few minutes. So we're talking about the health FSA. And the basic rule is this. If somebody is participating in the health FSA, and if it's the time of their qualifying event, they have a positive balance in their account. By positive balance, I mean they have had more money come out of their paycheck than they have actually spent up until that point in time. Okay? If they have a positive balance, the FSA must be offered under COBRA. If the balance is negative, then it does not have to be offered. Okay? When the FSA is offered, it's only offered for the remainder of the current plan year, not a full 18 or 36 months. Let's go through an example, just, I guess, help this make a little more sense. Let's say I'm your employee, you offer health FSAs to the employees, I elect, and I'm going to keep the math simple here. Let's say I elect $1,200 for the year. What that means is that on the first pay period of the plan year, you're going to take out, you know, the first increment. You know, if you pay 24 times a year, you're going to take out 1/24th of my $1,200 election. Let's say we get halfway through the year. So let's say $600 has been withheld from my pay 6 months into the year, right? Let's say I've only spent $300. Well, if I've put in $600 but only spent $300, I've got a positive balance of $300. Therefore, it has to be offered. Okay? If at the time I left, because I can actually spend my full amount elected before it actually comes out of my paycheck, that's called the uniform coverage rule. That's part of offering an FSA, is you must allow that to happen. So it's possible that when I quit my job halfway through the year, $600 has come out of my paycheck, but I've already spent $900. In that case, I've got a negative balance, and then the rules do not require the FSA to be offered. Okay? So keep that in mind. The premium then that somebody pays for their FSA election is going to be 1/12 of their annual election plus 2%. So you break it down into a monthly premium if they want to continue in the FSA. Some of you might be asking why. I mean, there's no tax benefit anymore. Why would they still want that? Well, if I've got a $300 positive balance, in fact, frankly, I have $900 available to spend because I can spend the entire amount, then it might be worth it for me to pay in a premium to still have access to that money that I've put in the account. Okay, so you must give me the option and offer that under COBRA. Now, some of you may offer the carryover for the health FSA that was created here a few years ago. Employers may allow employees to carry over up to $500 from one plan year to the next. If you do that, and if I was in the FSA and I quit, and let's say I had a positive balance and you offered me the FSA and I took it, when I complete that current plan year, assuming I kept paying in the full amount owed for the rest of the year, if I have money left over, I'm going to get to carry that over just like an active employee would. And because I've already made all the contributions that I need to make, there's no premium due anymore from me, but you must allow me to access that carryover amount just like you would an active employee who chose not to re-enroll in the plan the next year. Okay, so keep that in mind if you offer that carryover for the FSA. The only other coverage option I will talk about today is when in alternate plan is offered, and the easiest example of an alternate plan is a retiree plan. If an employer offers retiree benefits, assuming they are somewhat different in terms of coverage or cost, and therefore it's something less than what the employee had as an active employee, alongside the retiree plan, you'd have to also offer COBRA in case they wanted to maintain whatever level of coverage was available to them as an active employee. So you could still have to offer COBRA even though you've got this other coverage in place. Okay. Now, the section you've probably been waiting for, excuse me, the section that I think most folks anticipate, because they know when it comes to COBRA, it's all about sending out notices. And so here's where we're going to start breaking down all the different notice requirements that you have. Not that the rest of it wasn't important, but this, is a good place to be taking some notes and jotting down some things that you may need to be doing if you're not currently doing them. So I'm going to walk through each of these notices. I'm going to start in the upper right-hand corner, just like this is a clock. So at 1 o'clock, you see the general notice, and I'm going to go clockwise from there. These notices, with the exception of open enrollment and plan change, are all required by the COBRA law. The open enrollment and plan change notices are required, but those are really ERISA requirements. And because they apply to anybody who's on the health plan, which includes people on COBRA, we include them here. So I'll cover that when I get to those notices. So let's talk about the general notice. The general notice is the very first notice. This is the notice that is required to be provided to all new enrollees on the plan. I would say if I had to create a list of the most common mistakes that employers make today, the general notice would be at the top of the list. Either they're not providing it at all, or if they are providing it, they are not doing it correctly. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the purpose of this notice is to introduce or acquaint the employee and family with what COBRA is and what rights they'll have in the future if they lose coverage due to one of those COBRA qualifying events. And you have a responsibility to notify us, specifically in the case of a divorce or a dependent child ceasing to be a dependent, etc. So the general notice kind of lays it all out in general terms, not specific terms, because there has not been that loss of coverage yet. So what a lot of employers do in terms of making the error is their way of distributing the general notice is as part of the new hire process. When you hire somebody new and they're eligible for benefits, even if they're not, you're giving them usually, several documents. And what a lot of employers do is they just include the general notice in with all the other documents that a new hire gets. And that is going to create problems down the road, because the mistake is that they view this notice as the new employee notice, but it's not a new employee notice. It's a new enrollee notice. Okay, so let's say you hire me and I end up adding my whole family to the plan. And if my employer were to hand me the general notice, who haven't they notified? They have not notified my spouse and dependent children. The proper way to do this is to mail this notice to my home, addressed to me and spouse/dependents, if any. It can be one notice addressed to everybody in the household, but you've got to do it that way to demonstrate that you notified all new enrollees, not just the new employee. Okay. The other example of when this gets missed is when, let's say, I get hired and I'm offered benefits. I take them, but I'm single. It's just me. 5 years later, I get married and I add my new spouse to the plan. isn't my new spouse a new enrollee? Shouldn't she get her own general notice? And the answer is absolutely yes. So when the employer is mistakenly thinking of this as the new employee notice, they are missing situations like that where there's a new enrollee but not a new employee, and they are failing in their requirement to send out that general notice. Okay, so that is really important to understand. This is a new new enrollee notice, not a new employee notice. There are 90 days to get this notice out, mail it to the home. If by chance the family is coming on the plan, maybe children live with the former spouse at a different address, a separate notice would need to go to the dependents of that employee at that address. But first class mail is the directed method in the rules and regulations. That's considered good faith compliance. So send that notice out first class mail. Do not hand it out. All right. That's the message there. So in this notice, among many other things, is that language where you're telling that family that they're responsible for reporting a divorce or a dependent child ceasing to be a dependent, or in the case of an extension to COBRA, a secondary event or a disability. So let's say now that one of those things happen and the family is now notifying the employer of this event. And that's what this next slide represents. Notice from the qualified beneficiary, so the employee or family, to the employer or the plan administrator, saying, hey, this divorce has happened, or this dependent child has ceased to be eligible. There's been a secondary event or a disability. So this notification is coming back to the employer. But at this point, the employer has to look through the detail and determine, okay, is this a real event or a real extension to COBRA? Sometimes people have a separation, but the divorce isn't final yet. And so they feel compelled to report this to the employer. Is the employer going to send out the COBRA notice at that point? No, because the divorce isn't final yet. It has not caused a loss of coverage yet. When that does happen, then they can send it out. But in the meantime, no COBRA is going to be offered because the event didn't really take place. Or let me give you another example. Let's say somebody reports the disability and not all of those 4 criteria are met that I explained a few minutes ago. Maybe there's something missing. Maybe they haven't been deemed disabled by Social Security yet and they're still waiting for that official letter. Well, the employer isn't going to extend COBRA until that final criteria is met. Or this could happen. There is a 60-day deadline to report these things. Let's say that family member is just late in reporting it. Well, if they're past the 60 days, they're not going to be offered COBRA or be given the extension because they didn't follow the rules. They missed the deadline. So if any of those things happen where the employee or family reports one of these events and the employer determines, no, that's not really going to work, what do you suppose that employer is required to do? Well, they're required to send in writing back to the beneficiary or the family something called the notice of unavailability. That's a goofy title for a notice, frankly, but the notice of unavailability. Basically, you're saying, no, that thing you told us about isn't a valid event or a valid extension for this reason. And, maybe they just need to provide a copy of the divorce decree, or maybe, just, hey, let us know when you are officially deemed disabled by Social Security, and then we're ready to go. Whatever that message is. But that notice is telling them that, well, first of all, you're not getting what you thought. You're not getting either COBRA or the extension. And here's why. This notice is required within 14 days of the employer being notified in the first place. So not a very common scenario, but again, this notice carries the same penalties as any other. You'll want to make sure that you recognize it when it happens and send back that response in writing if that's not going to provide that person the COBRA coverage that they thought it would. Okay. All right. The next slide is the qualifying event election notice. This is the main notice. I'm sure everybody here, is familiar with this notice. It's the one everybody thinks about when we talk about COBRA. This is the one that has to go out when there's been a COBRA qualifying event. But there's so much writing on this notice that we really want to kind of dig into this just a little bit. First of all, what's the timing to get this notice out the door? Well, there are a total of 44 days, but that 44 days is shared by different parties. So if we have an employer and then they also have a plan administrator, the employer has 14 days to notify the plan administrator, and the plan administrator has 30 days to mail the notice. Okay, that's where the 44 days comes from. If the employer is both, they are the employer and their own plan administrator, then they have the full benefit of the 44 days. What we do, we're in the business of providing COBRA services. We provide these for roughly 15,000 employers around the country. When an employer signs up for our service, we're pretty clear in our agreement that, okay, you have 14 days, you have 30 days to notify us. I got those dates backwards a minute ago. My apologies. The employer has 30 days to notify the plan administrator. The plan administrator has 14 days to get the notice out. My mistake. I told you that wrong just a minute ago. For our clients, the client has 30 days to notify us, and then we have 14 days to mail out the notice once we're notified. So we use the same time frame. We still use the same 44 days, even though we're technically not the plan administrator. We're kind of using the date range, the date line here as if we were. Okay, so hope I didn't really mess everybody up with that. 30 days, then 14, total of 44. What's the best way to send this notice? Again, when you look at the regulations, they're fairly clear that sending it out first-class mail is deemed good faith compliance. But there's so much writing on this notice, don't we all want more proof? Because if there's ever a challenge to whether somebody was notified or not, we want to be able to prove that we did indeed send the notice. The best practice, even though it's not required, is for this notice to go out with something called a certificate or proof of mailing. This is a document available at the post office. There's a cost to it. It's $1 something, $1.35 or more, maybe now, the last time I checked. But basically, it's a form where you fill out who the letter is to and who it's from so that the addresses match on the form as they appear on the envelope. And then the post office verifies that, all of the addresses match up, and then they stamp the envelope with first-class postage, and it goes simply in the mail like any other first-class piece of mail. But then they stamp this certificate of mailing and give it back to the employer, and now the employer has proof from the United States Postal Service that that letter was mailed to that address on that date. Now, some employers take it a step further. They'll send it out and require a signature. I'm not saying that's wrong. I will point out that that creates some possible problems. So let's say that you send that certified letter, my COBRA notice, to me. I'm supposed to sign for it. Well, first of all, if I get a knock on the door that day and I answer the door and it's the postal person, I say, hey, how's it going? And they say, well, pretty good, but I've got this letter here you need to sign for. It must be pretty important. I might just say, no, I don't feel like it. That's got to be bad news. I'm not in the mood for it today. So I can refuse to sign for that letter. So now, essentially, you've got proof I don't have it. Someday, I may move. Those letters will not forward to a new address. I may just not be home that day. And then I get the little note that says, hey, we were here. Please come to the post office and sign for this. Again, I may not do that. Or this scenario could happen is the letter arrives, I'm not home, but the babysitter's there, and the babysitter signs for my COBRA notice. Well, now what do you have? You've got the babysitter's signature. Who can you prove you notified? The babysitter. Well, that's not exactly what we're going for here. So getting a signature might go too far. It might prove the person didn't get it. Well, then how do you prove they did get it with first-class mail? Well, that's the kind of cool thing about first-class mail. First-class mail, by law, is deemed received unless returned. If you send something first-class mail, if it doesn't come back, by law, the party you sent it to has it. Okay? So all we're doing is getting that extra little piece of proof from the post office that it was indeed mailed. And then If it does come back, then you figure out why. If it was addressed incorrectly, correct it, resend it. If they've simply moved and there's no forwarding address, then you can throw that in the filing cabinet, and that's further proof that you sent it. They weren't there, it came back. That's the best practice when it comes to the qualifying event election notice. When you go online to the DOL, they have model notices for both the general notice and the qualifying event election notice. Those are important notices. I mean, we keep track of what they're doing to make sure our notices are up to date. I mean, we do a whole lot more in our notices than the DOL does. When you look at those notices, you'll see that there's a lot of fill-in-the-blank information that needs to be still completed. And then if you read the instructions on using those notices, the DOL even says before using them, have your legal counsel review them to make sure that they're accurate and represent how you're complying with COBRA. So there are notices out there. They still have to be used with some caution. The other option is to use an outside source that will take full responsibility for what's in those notices. So consider your sources and use them accordingly. Some examples here of where employers have gotten into trouble for not offering COBRA properly. In this lawsuit, there was a gentleman named Raymond Underwood. He worked for the Floor Daniel Company down in South Carolina. And Raymond quit one day, and they handed him his COBRA notice. They didn't mail it. Well, his wife Linda was also covered on the plan. So he took the notice home. He never showed it to his wife Linda. A few months, or a couple months later, Linda calls up the former employer, Floor Daniel, and says, "Hey, I know Raymond left recently. I have a medical condition. I need to have COBRA. What do I need to do?" And she was told, "Well, just send in a check for the back premium. We'll put you back on the plan, and you'll be on COBRA." So they did that, and they were reinstated to the plan. But the Underwoods only sent that first check. They never paid a premium beyond that. Linda had surgery. She had Crohn's disease, and she needed to have surgery, and she turns in claims to the plan. They were self-funded of $400,000. And Floor Daniel said, "Whoa, wait a minute, we're not paying that." And the Underwood sued Floor Daniel, claiming that she was never properly notified of her COBRA rights. And the court basically said, that's true. She was not notified. The notice was handed to Raymond. There's no evidence that she was notified. Floor Daniel's argument was that she obviously knew she had rights because she called us. Well, that's neither here nor there. You still needed to notify her. Well, okay, but they never paid a premium beyond those first few months. And this was several months later when the surgery occurred. And the court did agree with that logic. And so Floor Daniel was not responsible for the $400,000 in claims. However, the court did assess an ERISA penalty of $100 a day for a calendar year. So Floor Daniel did have to pay the Underwoods $36,500. And the fact that Floor Daniel spent probably 2 or 3 times that amount just to go to federal court and defend themselves. It was a lot of money and a lot of a headache to go through simply because they handed out the COBRA notice instead of mailing it out. So that's just an example of an employer just not taking it seriously enough to make sure that a process was followed. This next lawsuit, there was a lady named Myra Torres Negron who worked for the Romalo brothers. She was their new HR person. She got on the job and realized that they had never ever sent out a COBRA notice. And she went to these folks and said, "Hey, we have to comply with COBRA, and that requires notices to go out. There are even services out there that we can purchase and handle this for us." And they said, "No, we're not doing it." And so they told her not to bother sending out notices. Well, she finally, I think, got fed up from working there, and she quit. Well, guess what she never got? She never got a COBRA notice, of course. She knew she had rights to COBRA, and she wanted health insurance, so she sued them to get COBRA. For some reason, they fought it, and their argument was that, well, she knew she had rights because she came and talked to us about it. So whether we notified her or not, she already knew what her rights were. And the court said, no, that's not even close. So they lose the lawsuit. not only do they have to provide her coverage, but they've got to pay out $50,000 both in attorney's fees and a penalty, let alone their own attorney's fees. Okay. Kind of a similar situation. Lisa Holford worked for Exhibit Design Consultants. She quit. She was never sent a COBRA notice. She sued because she wanted coverage. They go to court. Again, I don't know why, but their argument was that, well, we talked about COBRA in the employee handbook, and we have her signature that she read the employee handbook. So she knew her rights. And the court is saying, no, you have specific requirements to send notices. You didn't do that, you lose. And they also had to pay out about $50,000, both in attorney's fees and damages. Again, in addition to whatever their own attorney's fees were. What was kind of interesting about these last two lawsuits is that these are simply two people that wanted coverage. Most of the time, what drives a COBRA lawsuit is there's a big claim. And that didn't even occur in either of these situations. So just kind of interesting to see how some of these things can happen. And I'll point out that there have been thousands of COBRA lawsuits. And again, this stuff does happen, and that's why it's important to do this stuff right in the first place. All right, the extension notice is the next notice, and this is going to be sent when somebody has actually qualified for an extension to COBRA due to either that secondary event or the disability that we talked about earlier. Okay, all you're doing with this notice is confirming they get more time and telling them what their new COBRA expiration date is. But it's a notice that needs to go out. Okay. Again, these next two notices, open enrollment and plan change, are ERISA required notices, not COBRA required. So what ERISA requires is that the plan or the employer has to notify all plan participants of an upcoming open enrollment period and give them whatever information they need to make decisions about what plans they want to choose for the following plan year. When we say all plan participants, that also includes anybody who's on COBRA. COBRA participants are still plan participants. COBRA just gives them the right to stay on the plan. Also, there could be people who have had an event and COBRA has been offered to, but they're still in their 60-day election period. Those folks would also need to get the open enrollment information because, you know, they still might take COBRA and would have the same options for choosing benefits as an active employee. Okay, so remember, open enrollment applies not only to your existing employees, but anybody on COBRA or in their election period. The notice of a plan change, same thing. This is an ERISA requirement. The plan is required to notify all plan participants of any kind of a change to the plan. So the benefits are changing, obviously the carrier's changing, whatever. Make sure that anybody on COBRA is given the same notice, or anybody in their election period. The next notice is the notice of early termination, and this is what I would say the third most common notice. The most common will be the general notice for all those people going on the plan. The second most common will be the qualifying event election notice for all those people having qualifying events or being offered COBRA. And then the notice of early termination is when COBRA ends early. Now, some people go all the way to the maximum period, all the way to the end of 18, 29, or 36 months. If they do that, technically there's no notice requirement, even though a lot of services like ours and employers will still send what I would call a courtesy notice, just saying, just remember your COBRA has now expired. But if it ends early, and the most common reason COBRA ends early is due to non-payment. There are other reasons, and I'll cover those here in a few minutes. But if it ends early, the employer is required to send out this notice. Now, this notice isn't all that complicated. I mean, let's say somebody's COBRA is ending due to non-payment. All you're doing is saying, dear so-and-so, as of such and such a date, your COBRA was terminated due to non-payment. Besides that, I'm not sure what more there is to say. So it can be short and sweet, but it is a required notice. And if it's not being sent when somebody's COBRA ends early, there's that potential penalty that the IRS or DOL might assess if they come in and do an audit. Okay. All right. A couple more, and then we're done with notices. The conversion notice. This may or may not apply. It depends on your plan. If your plan has a conversion option where somebody at the end of COBRA within that carrier can convert from group coverage to individual coverage with no underwriting. I just don't know that these are that relevant anymore, but if it does still exist with your plan, then you're required to send this notice within the final 6 months or 180 days of COBRA. Basically, you're saying, your COBRA will be ending soon. Our plan has this conversion option. Here's what you need to know. So I'll leave that up to all of you to determine, is this something that we need to send out or not? Does your plan have a conversion option? If it does, this is a required notice. If not, then it's not. The last notice is something that may have to go out. Quite a few years ago, the IRS created some special rules to protect people who made minor errors in sending out their COBRA, sending in their COBRA premium. What was happening is people would send in their check for their COBRA premium and they would make an error. They would either leave off the number of pennies, and so it was short by a little bit, or they would transpose some numbers, and again, it was short by just a little bit. But the consequence for not making full payment was that your COBRA would be terminated. So the IRS said, well, this is happening too often. That's an extreme price to pay. You obviously meant to pay it. You just made a minor error. Let's put in kind of a safety net. And so what they created was the insignificant premium underpayment rule. And that basically says this: if somebody sends in their COBRA premium and it is underpaid by an insignificant amount, and insignificant is defined as the lesser of 10% of the premium that's due, or $50. So if somebody underpays their premium and it's small enough to be less than 10% or $50, whichever is lower, then they get special consideration. And that consideration is this: the employer has the decision to make. Do they accept the underpayment and consider it a full payment and move on? That's option one. Or option two is notify them in writing that they were this much short, and then give them 30 more days from the date of that notice to make up that underpayment. Then if they don't pay it, they'll be terminated for non-payment. So depending on which option the employer chooses will determine whether or not that notice has to go out, giving that person 30 more days to make up that underpaid premium. Here's an example of what that timeline looks like. Let's say the March premium is due on March 1st. The check arrives on March 25th. Well, this is still a timely payment because everybody gets a 30-day grace period for their COBRA premium. So the payment is timely. Unfortunately, the payment is short. It's underpaid by, let's say, $20. If the employer chooses not to accept it as full payment and they want to collect that $20, they will then have to mail a notice and provide that person 30 days from the date of that notice to make up the $20. So let's say the notice goes out on April 5th. That means by May 5th, if the person hasn't paid the $20, that person's COBRA gets terminated all the way back to March 1st. Then, of course, the balance of that premium that they had paid would be returned. Okay? So that's how that ruling works and what the time frame is and what the notice requirement is. Okay? Hope that makes sense. The last slide in notices is this one here. Employers, I think, in many cases still go through the practice of doing exit interviews when somebody is leaving employment from a company. And I think early on in COBRA, there was a tendency to just hand out the COBRA notice at that time. And that's really something that shouldn't be done. First of all, who's not in the exit interview? Well, spouses and dependent children. Again, the requirement is to notify all qualified beneficiaries, not just the employee. So handing it out means you missed potential family members. Secondly, I mean, having a COBRA conversation in the exit interview just is a bad idea. Sometimes these discussions are, emotional. There's a lot of other things going on. It could be very easy for somebody to misunderstand what you tell them, or you might even say something wrong. The best thing to do is just to let them know that I'll be sending you a notice explaining your rights to stay on the health insurance. After you read the notice, if you have questions, give me a call. But trying to answer questions in that situation is just not a good idea. So that's why we say not to do that in the exit interview. And also, the envelope that you see here on the screen is an example of how we would address notices going out to the family. It's going to go to that employee, and then it's going to say and spouse/dependents, if any, and then the address. Okay, that'll cover everybody in that household. All right, just a couple more sections to go. We're going to cover time frames, terminating events, and then premiums. I think that's going to kind of wrap it up. So we need to wrap it up here probably in the next 15 minutes or so and see if we have any questions. The time frames, we've kind of been dancing around this during most of the session today, but let me go through them in a little more detail. There's 44 days from the date of the qualifying event to send out the COBRA notice offering COBRA. Once that notice goes out, or from the loss of coverage date, whichever is later, that the beneficiaries have 60 days to elect COBRA. If they say, yes, I want COBRA, then they've got 45 days from the date they elect COBRA to actually pay anything. Once they've paid all back premiums within that 45 days and they're caught up and they're current, then they have a standard 30-day grace period every month. So those first few months of somebody being on COBRA are a little bit complicated in terms of, did they make a timely election? Did they then get caught up on premiums within 45 days of making that election? All right, so pay careful attention to the time frame here and understand what the requirement is in terms of deadlines for electing and paying that premium. That election date, that deadline is 60 days from the later of the date of the notice, basically the day it's postmarked, or the loss of coverage date, whichever is later. So, make sure that you are allowing that full 60 days based on that time frame. One option that you have is the option to determine which date you want to use as the event date. Okay. The assumption is that you're going to use the actual event date as the event date. That seems obvious, but the common scenario is that when somebody has a qualifying event, generally a plan will cover them through the end of that month. So let's say that that's the way this plan works. Then the employee quits on the 15th of January, but they're covered through the 31st. That's going to be the loss of coverage date. Well, the default here is that the event date is the event date. It's January 15th. And that means that January 15th triggers the 44 days in which that notice needs to go out. It also triggers the beginning of the 18 months of COBRA coverage. And so COBRA would end on July 15th, 18 months later of the following year. The option that employers have is, instead of using the event date as the event date and triggering those time frames, they can actually use the loss of coverage date as the event date. And a lot of employers do this because every month just has one event date, because anybody who has an event in that month is always covered to the end of the month. So we can use the 31st as the event date. I'm going to go to the next slide, and it's going to change slightly. So the employee still quits on January 15th, loses coverage on January 31st, but now we're using January 31st as the event date, meaning we've got 44 days from January 31st to get the notice out, and their COBRA will end 18 months later, which would be at the end of July of 2018, the following year. So if you're going to use the optional qualifying event date, one, do it consistently, don't flip-flop back and forth, and two, check with your carrier. Make sure your carrier understands that same time frame. You don't want somebody to have a car accident on July 20th, and you're thinking, oh great, I'm glad I used the optional qualifying event date rule so they're covered, where the carrier is saying, well, we didn't know you were doing that. We assumed COBRA ended on July 15th. That's not the time to find out that you and the carrier are not on the same page. So that's just a little heads up to get that clarified. Okay, let's cover ending dates and premiums, and then we'll see if there are any questions out there. COBRA will end whenever the maximum time period ends. At the end of 18 months, if it's a termination or reduction of hours that caused the loss of coverage. At the end of 29 months, if there's a disability extension. And at the end of 36 months, if the event was death of the employee, Medicare entitlement, divorce or dependent child ceasing to be an eligible dependent. The reason COBRA ends early could be for any of these: failing to make timely payment, getting coverage on another group health plan will terminate your COBRA, becoming entitled covered by Medicare will terminate your COBRA. If the employer simply cancels all group health plans, then there's no plan to be on, there's no COBRA. If a disabled person who's in that extension is deemed no longer disabled, which could happen, then COBRA is going to end shortly thereafter. Or if somebody's simply breaking the rules, they're going to be terminated for cause. For any of these reasons here, that notice of early termination would be required because COBRA is ending prior to the end of the maximum coverage period. All right, COBRA premiums. We've touched on this already. The main rule here is the maximum premium is 102% of the cost of the coverage. If we have a disability, it does go to 150%. Again, that's a maximum. Doesn't mean the employer has to charge all of that. It is a maximum for only those extra 11 months. All right. When can you raise somebody's premium? Well, you can really only do it once a year unless one of these things happen here. If the employer has not been charging 102%, at any point you want to, you can raise the premium to that 102%. If somebody chooses a more expensive plan or adds a family member, which either way might increase the premium, that increase in premium is applicable at that time. So you can pass that rate increase along then. You don't have to wait till the kind of the anniversary date of the plan. And finally, once somebody goes on that disability extension, if the employer does choose to raise the premium to the maximum of 150%, that would be applicable starting with month 19. Other than that, you can only raise premiums once a year. All right. So as we kind of start wrapping up here for this session today, I want to kind of leave you with some thoughts going forward, and then we'll see if you have any questions. But in our opinion, you know, having done this now for 30 years and having thousands of employers that we do this for us, it really comes down to this. What employers need to consider is, now that we know this, you've probably made some notes as to things you might want to do differently, but what you need to do, if we start at the top of this diagram here, developing a proper compliance program means having proper notices and proper procedures and everything documented, having everything in place that you need. And then as you have new enrollees, or you have qualifying events, or you have all of this activity regarding your health plan for COBRA activity, you maintain proper compliance by sending out notices, by, you know, taking elections and collecting premiums and managing people on and off the plan as necessary. Just when you get the hang of it, of course, what they tend to do is change the law somehow, whether it's actually amending COBRA or coming out with the ACA. You know, you need to make sure that you have a source for updates. Now, you know, kudos to Biggs Insurance Services for having this today, because you can be assured that I'm giving you the latest, greatest as it stands today. But things do change, and you know, having resources to know that something has changed is very important. Once you know there's been a change, or you learn something, maybe like today, that you weren't doing before, now you need to go back and update your program. You're going to either update your procedures, you're going to update your notices, you're going to modify what you're doing, because you know by making that change, it will lower the potential liability that the employer has for proper compliance. Not everything in this law is black and white. There are gray areas. How will you handle gross misconduct? How will you handle insignificant premium underpayments? How will you handle the determination of what date to use as the event date? Those are all choices that you have. It's good to consider those and decide, here's our stance on this particular topic, so that when it comes up, you already know what you're going to do. And then, you know, be consistent. Do it the same way all the time. So when you kind of follow the wheel here, in our opinion, that's the process for maintaining compliance and managing COBRA going forward. For us, and again, this is the business we're in, so we're pretty particular about doing things the right way. In our opinion, you're either in compliance or you're out. Doesn't matter if you are 75 or 80% compliant. There's still room there for error, for liability, and our opinion is we need to be all the way there. So if 100% compliance is what you're shooting for, then we need to make sure we've got those TAMRA guidelines in place. We've got all of the notices that we described and procedures on how to send out those notices. We have the process for elections and premiums of COBRA. We know how to get people on and off the health plan and work with our carriers for when people take COBRA and their COBRA ends. And then how do we document everything to prove, if needed, that we've done everything properly. If you can say you've got all of this handled, then great, you're doing what you need to be doing. If there are some things here that maybe need to be improved upon, now you need to figure out how are we going to get there. Do we go to our attorney? Do we go online and research it? Do we look at bringing on a third party? There are options there. Hopefully all of this information gave you a better understanding of what is required. Hopefully you could apply that to what you're currently doing, and now you can maybe put together an action plan on getting from where you are today to where you want to be in terms of compliance with this law. So we usually kind of set this up as basically two goals. The goal is to keep the IRS out of your business and your business out of court. If you're doing everything properly, you should be accomplishing these goals with no problem. If not, then please look for ways to get to that 100% compliance mode. So with that, what I'll do is, I guess, turn it back over to Tyson to see if there were any questions out there, or if there's anything else that you would like me to cover for everybody today. What do you think? Any further discussion out there from anybody?
So there was a couple questions that came in. One was just clarification that if you do not have an administrator, meaning like a third party like InfiniSource, is the requirement 14 or 44 days for the qualifying event letter?
Yeah, and I apologize. I as I'm talking, I'm going, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. So if an employer is doing everything themselves, you have the full benefit of the 44 days. But what a lot of employers do is they are the employer, but somebody else is maybe handling COBRA for them, whether it is a third-party administrator or a plan administrator or even an outsourced COBRA administrator like us. The employer is going to have 30 days to notify that third party, and then that third party will have 14 days to get the notice out. If you are outsourcing this, you're going to want to make sure with your provider that that's all clearly laid out. But if you're doing it on your own, you get the full benefit of 44 days to get that notice in the mail.
Okay. And then another one that came in that I thought was kind of interesting is with this webinar, because you mentioned how training is required by an administrator internally for an employer. Would this type of webinar, would this qualify, and how could you make it so if just, I guess, document or whatever else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm kind of glad somebody asked that because it's important. When we used to do seminars in person, we always gave out certificates. I've done it, I guess, a few times for a webinar. I generally don't think of it that well because I don't really know who's attending and who's not, because when we give out the certificate, what we like to do is have a list of attendees here internally, just in case you were to show that certificate to the IRS and they came out to us and say, hey, do you have any documentation that so-and-so attended this training? And if I got the list, I can say, yeah, right here. So Tyson, what I can do is I've got a certificate, and I can put it together and say, on September, what's today, the 7th, we, InfiniSource provided 2 hours of online training for COBRA, and sign it and have something. And then maybe if I at least had a list of names, I could just throw it in the drawer in case it's ever needed. I'd be happy to do that.
Sure, that sounds great. I think that's I thought it was a great question too. So that gets us, I guess, to the end of the webinar, unless there's anything else, Dan, that you wanted to add before we close up.
Just other than thank you, I know that you've been working with Jackie of our team, and we can do this. It's nice to be able to do it for you and your folks that you know out there. So we just appreciate the opportunity to share this information.
Yeah, and obviously at Biggs, we appreciate everyone for taking the time to be able to jump on this as well. So Dan, thank you for your time and presenting. I know that was a little bit of time off your schedule here, and thank you everyone else as well for attending. If you have any questions, there'll be a follow-up email with the certificate, and then also again with a copy of the slides. And we're happy to answer any other questions that might happen or might come up that we can answer here at Biggs Insurance. So again, thank you and appreciate the time.